So this is the Chesapeake Bay Program Objectives webinar. My name is Rachel Subitsky. I'm the Geospatial Project Manager at Chesapeake Conservancy's Conservation Innovation Center. We're based in Annapolis, Maryland, and you will hear a little bit more about some of these projects that we work on conservation and restoration projects using high resolution data that we also produce. Some people are still joining us, so hopefully they don't miss too much. I'm going to move ahead. So just so everyone knows, we are doing audience polling throughout. So all you have to do is go to www.menti.com and enter this code that's right here on your screen. You can do this on your laptop or your cell phone. So if you wouldn't mind pulling that up now, and then we actually have a question next to kind of test out this website to make sure it works for everybody. I'm going to leave this on the screen for a few more seconds so everyone can pull that up. And I just want to also mention, you can feel free to type in your questions in the chat throughout the presentation. After each presentation, there's going to be 4. We will answer a few questions, and then at the very end, we will answer the other questions that we don't have time to do after each presentation. So just feel free to type in the chat throughout the presentations. All right, so I'm going to go to the next slide. So the first question, I just wanted to try to get a gauge of who is in the audience today. So what type of organization do you represent? So nonprofit, local government, state government, federal, private, community member, or other. So I'm going to switch over. Oh, and it looks like everyone's already answering, which is awesome. So as people are answering, you can see it pops up live on the screen, which is pretty cool. So I will give us a few seconds to answer this. And you can see that the code is at the top of the screen right now. And it will be at the bottom of every slide that. And it's okay. So basically this will stay up and you can answer this question throughout until we get to the next question, and then we'll no longer be able to answer it. So feel free to take your time and respond to some of these, but it does look like we have a lot of local government, which makes sense because my listserv is a lot of local governments that I've been outreaching to throughout the project. And we have some state governments, nonprofits, federal, and other. And some regional government we see in the chat. Awesome, so we got a good variety here. So and you can see again, I'll bring up this code and it'll be on the top of the screen when there's a question. Great, so I'm just going to move on to the brief overview of the Chesapeake Bay Program Cooperative Agreement. I'm sure most of you have heard about it, which is why you are here today, so I won't go into too much detail about each one right now, but basically it's a 6-year cooperative agreement with Chesapeake Bay Program, and we have a multitude of partners that are all listed on the right of the screen. So objective 1 is the land cover and land use objective. We're working with University of Vermont Spatial Analysis Lab. Objective 2 is the hyper resolution hydrography mapping, which we're working with UMBC Department of Geography and Environmental Systems. Objective 3 is the best management practice opportunity mapping and field doc updates, which we're working with Chesapeake Commons and the Academy of Natural Sciences of Drexel University. And then objective 4 is the general geospatial support, which we're working closely with Chesapeake Bay Program, and all of the objectives have been working closely with CBP as well. That's just the brief overview of all 4. So objective 1, we're going to go into this one first, which is that land cover and land use updates. And this is led by me, Rachel Subitsky, as the project manager. And the main goal here is to create that high resolution land cover and land use maps for the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed for 2 time periods, 2017 and 18, which is what we're working on now, and then in the future will be 2021 and 2022. And as I mentioned, we're working with the University of Vermont on this project. So the next question is going to be, what is your familiarity with the 1 meter land cover and land use? So have you used it before? Have you attended previous webinars on the topic? Have you heard about just the new data release, or this is your first time learning more? Let's go to the next question here. All right, so now you should be able to go into this website with that code, same code, and answer this question. And this will just give me an idea of how much detail to go into in the background. I don't want to bore everybody if you all know about it, but just kind of getting an idea here. I'll give everyone a few more seconds to answer. It looks like a lot of people have used the data before, which is great. And then there are some people that are still learning about this for the first time. So I will give that brief background on it before I jump into the updates for this year. And again, this question will stay up, so stay live until we get to the next one throughout the PowerPoint. And these questions, the answers to these questions we will have saved, and we can share at the end with the PowerPoint when we share that. I'm just going to switch back over here. All right, so the brief update is back in 2016, we published our 2013 and 14 Chesapeake Bay watershed land cover and land use data sets. These are all 1 meter data sets that cover 100,000 square miles of the Chesapeake Bay watershed and surrounding counties. You can see on the left, this is the land cover, and you can see some of the classes of the land cover on the very left of that legend. In this data set, Virginia had their own classes that are listed there. They're similar, but they had slightly different definitions or slightly different classes there. So we also have a 6-class 1 meter data set. You can download that on our website as well. This is kind of a generalized data set that has Virginia and all the states as the same land cover. And just to kind of jump ahead to the new data sets, Virginia will have the same classes as the rest of the Bay. So we have reclassified the old 2013 and 14 data into our classes, and we've mapped some of the missing classes, and now we will be continuing on using the same classes that are on the very left there for the new data set. And then on the right, you can see the land use data set, which was created from the land cover and using different ancillary data sets to help reclassify the land cover. And the classes are a little bit different. Like we have different types of wetlands instead of just one wetland class. We have low vegetation that turns into different classes such as agriculture or turf grass or mixed open. So it's just a slightly different way of analyzing the landscape. And Chesapeake Bay Program uses the land use data set in a lot of their modeling. So that's just the brief background. And actually to go back a little bit, so our goal for this project is to create those same data sets. I'll explain some of the differences that will be happening, but for 2 different time periods, that 2017-18 and 2021-22. So just a summary of year 2. So we are at the end of year 2 and starting year 3 of this project. So there have been no external deliverables that were delivered in this year. So you haven't missed any actual products, but I have been doing local outreach, which I'm sure a lot of you have been getting my emails for the 2017-18 land cover draft product review. So this screenshot at the bottom here shows the web application that I uploaded. When the land cover for each locality is completed, I will reach out to the GIS contact that I have for the states and for the counties and allow 1 month for a review time. Those little purple stars that are on the screen there are people adding comments onto the data, giving us systematic errors that they find so that UVM can update their methodology for creating the land cover and try to fix all those errors. So this application is password protected, but when your data is available, I will be sending an email to you. And if I don't have your email, please email me, or if you haven't gotten the email, just let me know. And I can add you to that list. So this is just for the land cover. And then you can actually see on the right, there's this crazy map with lots of different colors. This will show, there's another web application you can go to on our website, and I'll show you how to do that. But basically, you can look at your geography or your locality and find out about when the land cover will be completed and when you can expect to be able to see it and provide us with edits. This is not when the final products are done. This is just when the draft product is done and where you can add your comments and feedback. So that's a pretty cool map that you can go online and check out. And that is still subject to change depending on the scheduling. I try to update it as much as possible. In addition, in year 2, we have a new land use classification scheme. So we have different classes this time around than we had in the 2013 land use. And we started creating methodologies for each of those classes. And I will actually, I have a slide and a few slides that will go into the differences in the land use. And lastly, in year 2, we've done local planimetric land use and zoning data reclassification. So basically, in year 1, I was outreaching to a lot of different localities and trying to collect as much local planimetric data as I could, and that we actually used to to reclassify the land cover into this land use using local data. And I'll go into that a little bit more as well. And just to explain where you can find these web applications, if you go to ChesapeakeConservancy.org, under our Conservation Innovation Center tab, there are 2 places you can find the applications. Under Geospatial Web Applications, there is a More Applications section, and that's where you can find these 3 web apps. Also, we have our CBP page, which is under our Analysis and Consulting tab. And that's where you can actually find the webinar from year 1, and this webinar will be posted there as well. And we have the land cover production schedule and hydrography status. Those are all in the same web application. So Objective 2 will go over the hydrography. That can be found under these tabs. And then we have a planimetric vintage web application. We can see what data I've collected from which localities. And then the land cover data review app is also there. But that is password protected, and you can email me if you want the password. Usually I will reach out to you and provide that when your data is ready for review. So year 3, that's the year that we are in now. So these are the deliverables that you can expect. In summer 2021, it's a big year. We will have the wall-to-wall, so the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed, the new land cover classification that for 2017 and 18. We will also go back and correct the 2013 and 14 land cover for any mistakes that we may have missed in the last production. And in addition to that, we will have a change product for the 2 time periods. In addition to that, we will have the wall-to-wall 2017 and 18 land use classification. We will reclassify the 2013 data set to our new classes, and we will have a change product between the 2 dates as well. That's 6 large data sets, and they will be available to download off of our website for free. Anyone can go and download. These will be in raster format, and there's usually lots of different options to download by state, by county, or by the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed. So then when this will be available, I will make sure to send out a notification via listserv again. And if you're not on the listserv that I originally sent out the invite for this webinar, please email me and I can add you to that list. Also, just if you go on our website, we have a land cover and land use page. They'll be up to date on there as well. And as you can see on the right, how we divvied up the production and schedule of creating the land cover and land use, we tried to get a HUC watershed in each state kind of first in the production schedule. So that's why they're numbered there. I wanted to get some states and data first. Once you've done your land cover review and UVM incorporates your edits and finalizes the data, if you have a need for the land cover or data sooner than this summer 2021, just email me, and if it's finalized, we can share it with you and just say subject to change, and just so you know that it is, until summer 2021, we are allowed to change it, but we are, if the data is ready and you have a need for it, just let us know and we can share that with you. And just to show you an example of what this land cover and land use, but this is an example of land cover change will look like. You can see there's a lot of different colors like purples and deep reds and different shades of green. We don't have a legend on this as of now, but we will obviously give you a legend with the data. And this is really showing what new buildings have been in place, what tree canopy loss is there, what tree canopy gain is there, where is there impervious surface growth or removal, and what does it change to. So this is going to really give you a good idea of what's going on your landscape, what class is changing to what class. So you can kind of see what's going on and make those decisions and planning decisions from this. So it's going to be really cool and really detailed data. So I think it'll be really exciting to see what type of projects can be done with this. And we'll also do this with the land use as well. So to go over the new high resolution land use classes, so we have a lot more detail this time around. And again, we will be going back and making the same data set for 2013 and 14. But we've had it kind of grouped in a certain way so that basically we can get really, really detailed, and there can be up to like 60 classes, or we can have an option to roll it up just into these larger groups and categories so that you don't have too much information if you don't care about all the details. So let me just go over a few of these, or the groups of these. So we have our water class, which is now split up into lentic, which is estuaries, lakes, and ponds, and then we'll have a lotic class, which is streams and ditches. We then have in the wetlands and water margins category, we'll have the tidal and the non-tidal, and within non-tidal we'll now have the floodplain and headwater wetlands, and then an other class. And another new one is the bare shore class, which will have a lentic bare shore and lotic bare shore. Under forest, instead of just one forest class, we now have three. There's the contiguous forest, which is greater or equal to 1 acre, fragmented forest, which is less than an acre of forest, and then natural succession. So this is, vacant lots or abandoned mines where the vegetation is allowed to grow back naturally. Then we have the production category, which is the agricultural class, which then goes into cropland, pasture and hay, orchard and vineyard, and then the fallow and idle class. We now also have a timber harvest category, the extractive class, which is active mines and quarries, and then solar fields. And then the last one is the developed category, which we have impervious, which is the roads, structures, other impervious, which will include railroads. Pervious, which is turf grass, bare construction is a new one, and then suspended succession, so that's like transmission lines. And then the last one is urban tree canopy, so this will cover any of the tree canopy that doesn't fall into the forest category, so tree canopy over roads, structures, impervious, or turf grass. So I know this is a lot, and the data set will have all of these subclasses, but also, again, roll up into these larger categories. So if you don't want all that detail, you don't have to be overwhelmed with information. And lastly, just a little bit about how we are using the local data to do the land cover to land use reclassification. We are working with Washington College's GIS department as a sub-awardee on this project, and they're reclassifying about 100 counties, and we're doing the rest in-house based on data sharing agreements and so on. And on the left here, you can see an example of the local land use, and you can see these are pretty broad categories, and they're just not as detailed as the 1 meter data, but it gives us the context of what's going on the landscape. What is the low vegetation class in the land cover? How would that translate into the land use? So, the big orange color there is agriculture. So now we know the low vegetation in the land cover would be translated into an agriculture class. Same with that green turf grass. So then we know anything in the residential areas, for example, in the land cover that is low vegetation will now be turf grass. And on the right is just the 1 meter land use from our last data set. So it's going to look slightly different. For example, we're trying to remove the bubbles around the houses and things that maybe were not naturally on the landscape, but we had to make decisions about last time. So we're trying to make the data set better this time and with different classes. All right, so that is it for objective 1. I know Jake is going to read off any questions that may have popped up throughout my presentation, and if not, we can go to the end of the presentation for questions.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. There were no questions in the chat for this presentation, but I do encourage anyone who has thoughts pop into their head to please drop it in the chat as needed through Zoom.
Awesome. Well, that means I did a good job presenting. So if there are no questions, that's awesome. But yeah, feel free if you have any more that pop up throughout, just please, type it in the chat. So we're going to switch over to objective 2. So David will be taking over.
Thanks, Rachel. So I'm David Savejo. I'm a geospatial technical lead at the Conservation Innovation Center. I lead our hydrography efforts. So as part of that, I'll be talking to you today about objective 2, which is our hyper-resolution hydrography development. We're partnering with the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, specifically Dr. Matthew Baker of the Department of Geography and Environmental Systems. And the goal of this objective is to create high-resolution maps of stream channels, roadside ditches, and agricultural ditches from LiDAR elevation across the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Next. So some brief background on this project. It's sort of come about in 2 parts. So we had a grant from the Chesapeake Bay Trust in 2016 that we were awarded to develop a scalable approach for mapping stream channels in high resolution. And again, we collaborated with Dr. Matthew Baker. And as part of this grant, we did a really extensive literature review of channel formation processes, research that's been done on that, existing methods to map stream channels, some state-of-the-art methods that were newer. And then we had a field validation component where I visited several different watersheds distributed throughout the Bay watershed to cover different land use types, different physiographies, different geologies. And I essentially map these streams. I would walk these streams, take photos of where this channel is initiated, describe the streams, take notes of the behavior, whether or not they were intermittent or perennial. And I brought this data back to the lab, and we tried many different methods. We compared lots of state-of-the-art methods. We tried methods that we were considering developing. We did an extensive comparison of how these different methods performed, and we submitted a report summarizing these findings. Then in 2018, we received this cooperative agreement from the Chesapeake Bay Program to actually implement the method that we arrived at through the Chesapeake Bay Trust Grant. So again, this is in collaboration with UMBC. And this time around, we have our method done. We know how we're going to do it, but what we're doing this time is automating and parallelizing these methods and implementing them widespread across the 64,000 square mile Bay watershed. And we're going to develop a manuscript to submit as a report and hopefully find a journal to publish it. Next. So a bit about our approach. Typical stream mapping approaches in a GIS environment would rely on predictive layers, including accumulation and curvature and slope. So these are all derivative layers from an elevation model. And most approaches focus on finding some sort of threshold in these derivative layers that would differentiate a hill slope from a channel. And the idea would be that this threshold would identify the point where the channel initiates. That would be the channel head. And then you would just trace it down slope from there. But in reality, channels form in different ways in different geographies. So one threshold is not going to work everywhere. And channels don't always flow continuously down slope from where they start. So for example, in karst geographies, channels sometimes go underground and sometimes they never surface again. So to just trace the line down slope might not be the most accurate way to represent them. So our approach, instead of relying on thresholds of predictive layers, we use the elevation model itself, and we use a landscape classification algorithm called geomorphons, which you can see some diagrams of here. And this classification algorithm uses line of sight from every pixel in the landscape in 8 different directions, and it assesses the number of surrounding pixels that are higher, lower, equal in elevation. And based on that configuration, it assigns every pixel one of 10 constituent landform classes, which you can see described here on the right. And then on the left are 3D little model schematics of what these different landforms look like. And the ones we're primarily concerned with for stream mapping are the ones that are classified as valleys and pits, which are the blue and black colors. And then on the little 3D diagram, they're in about the 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock position. So these are classes where, in the case of a pit, it's easy to conceptualize. In all 8 different directions, the surrounding terrain is higher. In the case of a valley, there's a little bit of wiggle room, which is why you can see valley represented in the middle 7 different times. So there can be anywhere between 5 to 7 pixels higher and anywhere between 0 to 2 pixels lower than the focal pixel to be classified as valley. And then I'll show you here on the next slide how this looks in practice. So we start with, like I said, a LiDAR elevation model. So you can see here a stream valley running from bottom right to top left, and a few tributary valleys, and then some development in the surrounding landscape. And then we run this classification model first at a coarse broad scale. So this is using 10-meter elevation data in a very broad search radius for this geomorphon algorithm. And you can see the areas that I pointed out as stream valleys are now mapped in blue and black. And some of the development, which is usually on the tops of hills, is mapped in red, which corresponds with ridges and peaks. And slopes are in yellow. So next. So the next part of the process, we run this classification algorithm a second time, this time using higher resolution 1-meter elevation data and a much narrower local search radius. And you can see the terrain looks a lot different this time. So instead of the whole stream valleys getting mapped as blue, the actual channel itself at the bottom of the valley is getting mapped in blue. But you can see a lot of other stuff that gets mapped in blue too. So these are things like roads and curbs and gutters along the developed areas. And those are just things that we generally would not want to include in our stream map. So if we go to the next slide here, we take from that coarse classification and we extract a stream valley network, which you can see in blue. And we use this as a sort of geomorphic filter to isolate the areas where we look for stream channels. So you can see by applying this, we eliminated all of the developed areas that you now see in dark blue. And what we're left with in bright blue are the channelized areas that fall within that stream valley or contiguous with it. But again, not all of these are stream channels. So if we move to the next image, now you see a slightly different version in green. And this version has been reviewed manually. So we've looked at all of these different channel-like features, and we've identified the ones that we would consider to be stream channels and classified them as such. And we've identified the ones that would be not necessarily stream channels, but still within that valley network. So there was a detention basin in the middle there, for example, and a few ditches or floodplain depressions. So we've identified these and classified them as such. But we haven't discarded them. We just classified them so that we can select the type of features we want for any given scenario. So in this image, we're only showing the stream features. And then in the next image, actually, if we could go back one. So another important thing to note about this channel skeleton, as we call it, is that it's discontinuous. So if you look, and Rachel's pointing here to a few roads that cross the stream channels. So these result in gaps because the LiDAR doesn't appear as a channel there, it appears as a ridge because it's a road, which is fine for some applications, but for some other applications, a more traditional connected stream network is preferable. So we have an algorithm that we run here that uses some least cost path analyses that connect the channel skeleton across these obstructions or gaps without the need to condition the DEM ahead of time, which is a big time saver. So next. Here's an example comparing the NHD, which you can see in red, with our data, which you can see in blue. So our data is, I guess, just it's more precise. It maps the stream channels and the individual meanders and the general layout of the stream much more accurately. It also maps this channel on the left, which was entirely missed by the NHD. And then next I have just a zoomed out example with the LiDAR background. So just looking at this, you can already see plenty of omission from the NHD. And then our data in green, again, is more accurate and comprehensive. And it provides a lot more information than you could get from the NHD alone. Next. So some year 2 background. We had a Lower Susquehanna pilot that we completed in September, and we've shared with the advisory committee and other interested parties. We received some feedback on this, and we're incorporating revisions based on that feedback and based on our own observations of the data. We've done watershed-wide valley mapping. So this is that coarse, broad scale classification that I showed before. We have this for the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed using 1/3 arcsecond NED. We have the geomorphon layers and then the actual extracted valley network. Next. In year 2, we also began watershed-wide channel mapping, which is still ongoing. And we've produced initial channel maps for 29 of the 55 Huck 8s in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And these are just the pre-QAQC channel maps, so they've not been classified into different stream and non-stream features. But we've begun developing QAQC approaches. So in 2019, for that Lower Susquehanna pilot, we developed a manual process that we've since improved to make it more consistent. And in year 3, we're looking to automate this process using machine learning, which I'll talk about in a couple slides. And lastly, in year 2, this is a sort of ongoing thing. We're always improving our process. So we've automated these methods in a series of modular Python scripts, so you can run any individual process independently of the others, which allows you to go back and tweak certain components. We've refined our valley delineation, which you can see an example of in the bottom. There's a very broad, flat portion of this watershed, which previously we weren't mapping the valleys in that wide open area, but we've changed some parameters, which you can see on the right. Now those broad valleys are getting mapped in blue. We've improved our channel connection algorithm that I showed prior. And lastly, probably the biggest improvement is that we've parallelized our processing on UMBC's supercomputer so that we can run many different Huck 12s concurrently. So we can process a Huck 8, which let's say is composed of 30 or 40 Huck 12s. We can run a whole Huck 8 in the time it takes for a single Huck 12 to run, because we're running all 30 of them at the same time. So that's a big improvement in processing speed. So this map, Rachel talked about a web application showing land cover production status and hydrography status. This map's taken from there, and there's a hyperlink at the bottom. But basically, for these watersheds that you see in green and yellow, we have initial channel maps completed. And these are actually all of the DEM, or all of the Hucks where we have complete DEM coverage, with the exception of those in Pennsylvania. We do have DEM coverage for those watersheds, but those DEMs are relatively old. They're from 2006 or 2008. And we've been told that new DEMs are going to be delivered by the end of this year. So for now, we're holding our breath, hoping that they do get delivered. But if they don't, then in January, we will make a decision to move forward with the DEMs that we have. So regardless of how that plays out, we expect to have initial channel maps completed by summer 2021 for the entire Bay watershed. So I touched on this before. A year 3 deliverable is to automate this QAQC process. So currently it's a manual process of assessing and classifying each channel-like feature. And you can see an image of this on the right. So we have a drop-down menu with, I think, 6 or 7 different types of features, including stream, roadside ditch, agricultural ditch, gully, floodplain depression, detention feature, headwater wetland, and other. So currently we would select individual features and use this drop-down menu to classify them as one category or another. And what we plan to do is use this manually classified data as training data for a machine learning model that will use the training data, the geomorphon data, the DEM, lots of intermediate data from the geomorphon process, and it will come up with a probabilistic estimate of any given channel or any given feature falling into one of these classes. So we expect the majority of these features to be very confidently classified by the machine learning model as one of these classes. But we also expect some of them to not be confidently classified. The computer will have a difficult time putting them in a given bin. And so those are the features that we want to focus a human reviewer's attention on, as opposed to having a person sitting there looking at every single feature on the map. So we expect that'll really expedite this review process, which is currently the slowest part of the whole process. We're also working on attribution in year 3. So we have an algorithm to calculate bank height from the channel rasters using some intermediate geomorphon data. And similarly, we have an algorithm for estimating channel width, which you can see an example of here. So this is a channel, and the green pixels represent narrower widths. And then you can see where the channel widens towards the bottom, the pixels become yellow and orange. And there's a little example with the measure tool in ArcGIS, shows 11.22 meters. And then our calculated width from our automated algorithm shows 11.18 meters. So it's very accurate. And we plan to produce these layers in conjunction with our channel layers. So we'll have these everywhere. And then ongoing method refinement, as I mentioned, we're always trying to improve our process. So just some current items that we're working to improve are the channel skeleton connection algorithm. There's a few certain instances where it doesn't make connections where you'd expect them. So we're working to improve that. And one of those is over open water. So when streams feed into lakes or large rivers, we'd like to get nice center lines across those water bodies connecting to the downstream outlets or tributaries. Next. So I've told you a lot about what our method is and how it works, but now I'm going to talk about what are the expected data products. So what can you expect to get out of this? So if we click next. So the first product is that 10-meter valley network that I discussed and shown here in blue. And then this will be a raster. And then the next product here is a 1-meter channel raster shown in bright blue. And the red arrows indicate some disconnected portions. And you can see a few of these are due to roads, like the ones towards the right. And then a few of them, like the ones at the bottom left, the channel just is not well defined in the LiDAR. So that channel may actually disperse before picking up downstream, or there may be dense vegetation causing that interruption in the LiDAR. So another product we'll provide is this connected polyline channel network. So you can see here the lines connect across those discontinuities. And this polyline network will be attributed. So we can summarize the bank height, and we can summarize channel width and stream order and so on along these reaches, as well as having those continuous raster estimates. So I think now we're going to go to a poll question. So something that I would like to get an idea of is which attributes would be most useful for you all as users to see in this, this polyline network. So just to give you some ideas, some examples that we're already planning to include would be things like stream order or length or bank height or channel width. But I just thought it would be a good idea to ask the end users what they would find most useful.
Yeah, and this one will also be up until the next question, so you don't have to feel pressured to write it as they pop up on the screen. I'll leave it up for a few more seconds. Awesome. This should be really helpful for you, David, to see all this. That's cool. And again, we'll share this with the slides at the end too. All right, so I'll just go back, but yeah, feel free to continue to fill this out as we continue with the presentations. And I think that's the last slide. Jake, were there any questions in the chat?
Nope, not for that presentation.
All right, well, thanks, David. We'll continue on.
All right, thanks, Rachel. Thank you, David. My name is Louis Cadell. I am a geospatial program manager for Objective 3 of the Cooperative Agreement, BMP Planning and Reporting. Today, we'll kind of provide a very broad overview of the work that we've been doing as a part of this objective. I'll be focusing more on the work that the Conservation Innovation Center has been doing, and my colleague Katie Walker will be focused on the field doc portions of the work that Chesapeake Commons and Drexel University's Environmental Data Science Center has been working on. As a part of this objective, the main goal is essentially to create a best management practice opportunity data set for the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed and a streamlined platform for project identification, prioritization, tracking, and standardized reporting. Next. So, in a nutshell, Objective 3 will be seeking to map BMP opportunities for the watershed. In this presentation, we'll also be covering the integration of the data into planning tools and workflows. We'll also be covering improving tracking and reporting capacity within the field doc platform, and then how designing and integrating data models will support WIP planning. Next. So the Conservancy is pretty much focused on the BMP opportunity mapping portion of this project. And essentially what we'll be doing is providing these opportunity layers to regional and local restoration planners and implementers throughout the watershed. And the hope is that this will streamline watershed planning, engage a wide audience of practitioners, provide a better understanding of potential opportunities for a suite of practices, hopefully provide a more efficient starting point for field visits when meeting with landowners. And we also hope that this resource will provide scientific validity for funding proposals. Next. How will these layers be used? The data will be made available to stakeholders for restoration planning. Currently, we do not have a scheduled release set in stone yet. We are carefully working with stakeholders to come up with an appropriate strategy, as this data is somewhat more sensitive compared to land cover and hydrography. The data is intended to be incorporated into planning tools such as Field Doc. And we're also looking into the feasibility of integrating the data with modeling efforts to approximate load reduction at a site-specific scale. Next slide. So kind of to give a broad overview of each of the components, as I mentioned, the Conservancy is focused on the 3 bullet points on the left here: creation of the BMP opportunity footprints for planners and integrating that with systems such as Field Doc. In Field Doc, providing layering options for identifying those high-performing potential projects, and then wrapping all of that into a planning module that practitioners and planners can use to easily identify and assess the suitability of projects in the ground and potential load reductions associated. In terms of the back-end modeling functionality for FieldDoc, this is where Drexel University's environmental data science team comes in. They've been busy working on these very novel models for API integration into this platform, including a rapid watershed delineation API, which essentially delineates the area draining to a certain practice location in record time. They've also been working on a rapid zonal statistics API, which will calculate the land use composition within that drainage area. And they've also been focusing on a confidence metric, which will essentially calculate the site-specific load reductions for a specific practice on the ground and give an estimate as to how that compares with the average modeled load of the CBP CAS model. And then last but not least, Chesapeake Commons will be further developing the tracking and reporting workflows for FieldDoc and looking at the feasibility of integrating FieldDoc with other reporting systems across the Bay watershed. Next. So for year 2, the Conservancy focused our BMP opportunity mapping for agricultural BMPs with a pilot project in the lower Susquehanna. Chesapeake Commons has been focused on FieldDoc updates, adding functionality, and largely focused on helping Pennsylvania with their county WIP dashboards. And the Drexel team has been working on further development of their novel APIs and additional modeling capabilities on the back end of FieldDoc. Next. So as a part of the pilot effort in the lower Susquehanna, the Chesapeake Conservancy's Conservation Innovation Center took a look at the Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework GIS Toolbox, or ACPF, developed by the USDA out in the Midwest, and brought that to the Chesapeake. And while these GIS tools were designed for practices in the Midwest and landscapes out in the Midwest, there is transferability to the Chesapeake, and for this first go around, what we've been doing is breaking down the toolbox into its essential components and then rebuilding with high resolution data and programming scripts to semi-automate this process to scale to larger geographies. And out of this output, we have an initial set of BMP opportunity footprints, as you can see under that first bullet there. Once we produced this data, we convened 2 advisory groups in the lower Susquehanna, one more technically focused with modeling expertise, and another made up of local planners and practitioners with on-the-ground knowledge. And from these 2 groups, we received feedback on our methodology, general impressions on this data, and one important thing that definitely came out of these advisory groups was a caution in terms of being careful in how we release this data, because it is very site-specific and sensitive in many ways. So currently our release strategy is under development. We are continuing to discuss with stakeholders, and we plan to continue to do so as we move to new regions. I also want to point out that these BMP opportunity footprints are to serve as a reference. They're not meant to be prescriptive. And we want to be careful about that as we continue our messaging around this data. Next. So over the next year, we plan to move beyond the lower Susquehanna towards the midshore region of the Delmarva Peninsula, and also the Shenandoah Valley. marked as numbers 2 and 3 on the map on the right. We are continuing collaboration with Penn State and USDA, ARS, and NRCS staff into the ACPF methods. I do also want to point out that ACPF was a starting point for us, but we are looking at additional BMP opportunity footprints and feasibility for mapping them in different areas. And as a part of this, we'll be reviewing lists of BMPs that are not only important across the watershed, but within specific regions to different stakeholders in those regions. And then as mentioned before, we want to be careful about the data release strategy, continuing to discuss with stakeholders both across the watershed and specific to different regions and states. And then initially we'd like to share beta versions of this data with identified advisory partners and groups in order to get that initial feedback. And because this process is semi-automated, we do plan to revisit previous regions that we've already completed in order to further refine the results. Next. So we do have an open-ended question for the audience. What management practices would most be useful to you and that you would like to see an opportunity map for?
And this one is a word cloud, I believe, so more people that are interested in certain practices, it'll pop up larger than the others. And this question, again, will stay up until the next one. So you guys can think about it a little bit longer, but I'll give it a few seconds. All right, looks like a lot of people like the riparian buffers. Pretty cool. So yeah, feel free to continue to respond, but I'll go back to the PowerPoint and save some time here.
All right, I think now we'll pass the presentation to Katie.
Hi, everybody. So as we mentioned here, beyond the BMP opportunity mapping, we are partnered with Chesapeake Commons and Drexel A&S, and a huge part of what we're doing is looking at the tracking and reporting system for BMP implementation. And we did some initial research and interviews across the different jurisdictions, and we found a couple challenges to tracking BMP implementation currently. Of those, a big part of what we're looking at is that there are several different programs that are funding and tracking different implementation efforts, and each of those have their own systems, metrics, requirements for tracking and reporting best management practices. Across each of those different systems, especially with different reporting platforms, there's a variety of functionality that's built into those, making some functionality available to certain grant recipients, but not across the board. And this lack of a centralized system until you kind of get down to that state level final reporting for the phase 3 WIP right now, you really don't have any cohesive system and no understanding of progress made until that final reporting step. In addition, there are issues with data privacy, as well as lack of a spatial resolution. So some of these reporting platforms are tracking the money and tracking certain metrics like acres implemented, but not necessarily giving it a spatial resolution. So really understanding where some of these practices are being put in the ground, so you can kind of remove them from opportunities available. In addition, as we kind of mentioned, because there's this lack of a centralized system, and you don't really understand the comprehensive view until final reporting, a part of this is that a lot of the data is stale or static. It's being tracked or implemented via spreadsheets. It's being transposed very manually, and it's not always well documented, which really gives just this static input of progress, where we're looking at, like, in CAST scenarios, you're looking at 2018 progress, 2019 progress, which is great from a watershed-wide perspective and making our goals to 2025. But for a lot of these local and regional partners that are working on getting practices in the ground, that annual progress doesn't help guide your planning efforts day to day. So we've partnered with the Commons for their Field Doc platform, which is focused on tracking and reporting best management practices. It's a metric-based tracking, and every program that comes in can have their own metrics, but they're built off of a standardized suite that's available, as well as the reporting process and project implementation reports. It's standardized across each program, but it's also customizable for what metrics you select from the available options. This enables users to manage all facets of planning, tracking, and reporting the restoration process. And it supports kind of across the watershed a whole suite of users with language that's similar to what matches the on-the-ground workflow of our anticipated users. So while there are many different users of Field Doc currently and within the past couple of years, through this cooperative agreement, we're expecting to mostly engage with the grant administrators and managers. The regional WIP planners and grant recipients are kind of the groups of people that we envision a lot of this work will be mostly focused on. In the Field Doc platform, on the right, you can kind of see this image of how the platform is broken down into projects, sites, practices, and then reports. And this is just, like I said, kind of showcasing how that ontology is trying to match the on-the-ground workflow of that projects are where group sites are happening. Sites are based off of where the work has occurred. They tend to be parcel or farm scale. The practices describe specifically what's being done, so the actual BMP codes. And then the metrics will give insights onto what's being measured, and a lot of them have associated targets for how many acres you're looking to get implemented, how much nitrogen or phosphorus you're looking to reduce for a certain practice. And then the installation reports allow you to actually track the progress. If it's a 10-acre project and in the first year you got 3 acres done, it allows you to report that 3 acres while tracking progress towards the whole collectively. So as we move through this cooperative agreement, there's continuously going to be updates to the Field Doc platform. Some of this work already existed, and what we're doing is just slowly getting feedback and adapting it for what is currently needed. In Commons platform, there is on-the-fly modeling with analytical APIs that are being integrated, and currently there have been estimates for nitrogen, phosphorus, sediment reductions, and they were associated with isolation tables that came from the CAST team. So data that runs off of the same data that is used in CAST. What we're looking to do through this project is integrating an API from Drexel's Academy of Natural Sciences, and we're looking to achieve site-specific load reduction estimates that go above and beyond what is currently available in Field Doc. In addition to the reduction estimates, the export and formatting of the data is compliant with NIEN, the National Environmental Information Exchange Network, which is the same standardized reporting that goes to the EPA for progress towards the watershed implementation plans. And then a very recent change has been an open ledger change log, which allows a user to see a practice over time as maybe boundaries have shifted for where a forest buffer was intended to get implemented, but later on down the line, the landowner decided that they wanted to shift some of where that buffer was going to be put in place. You can actually make those changes and it gets saved as a record over time. So you don't lose any of the history, similar to a track changes in a Google Drive or a OneDrive document. So we're going to switch over to our Menti, and we want to just ask the question of, do you currently use Field Doc? And we recognize that some people are using it for planning purposes versus tracking purposes. Some folks have looked into it in years previous, but didn't see functionality that they were looking at. And so we're just kind of trying to get a sense for what our user base here. Awesome. So it looks like we have a lot of folks who have never used the Field Doc platform, a couple of folks who may have dabbled with it, and then a couple for planning and tracking. So as Rachel has said earlier, please continue to submit answers for this. It will be live until we kind of hit our next question. So. Awesome. So with that in mind, I wanted to do a little bit more of a dive into the Pennsylvania pilot that we did under year 2 of this cooperative agreement. So with our partner Commons and the Field Doc platform, we worked with Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, and we were iteratively developing software functionality in Field Doc based off of feedback that we were getting from the state and from the regional coordinators and practitioners throughout Pennsylvania. And things like the change log was something that was requested specifically from our user feedback in Pennsylvania. And there are other software functionality that we've implemented on the back end. In addition, we've been working with PADEP to pilot a tracking dashboard towards the watershed implementation plans. And these are focused at the county scale to align with the county action plan process currently going on in Pennsylvania. And so each county is getting a dashboard where we're tracking metrics from their individual county action plans of how much they're looking to reduce in certain nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment goals, but also acres of implementation for different types of practices. And then all of the data that's getting submitted through Field Doc is getting aggregated and reported to those county dashboards. And while certain practices are still private and no site-specific information will be shared, it gets aggregated at the county level so that all of the county action plan coordinators and their trusted team members can see and track progress through annually. And in addition, some key features that we've been working on include a Rails system, which basically walks a user through a practice reporting from start to finish. It'll kind of prompt what section you should fill out and focus on next. You know, if you don't go in and fill out the geographic location, it will remind you to do so. If you haven't submitted a report, it will remind you to do so. In addition, we've worked on batch processing, which provides the capacity to upload and support multiple practice footprints at one time. So especially if you have GeoJSON or Esri shape files, you can upload those into FieldDoc, but it doesn't have to be one by one anymore. You can kind of submit a whole bunch at once, and it will create separate pages for them, and then you just go back out and fill them out. There are a few administrative controls that have been added for reporting and tracking towards the metric targets. Some of that is related to, drawing a practice footprint has a very, on the back end, the GIS will estimate the acreage implemented, but sometimes it doesn't match specifically what you're going to be planting on the ground. So rather than trying to tweak the footprint to get it exactly, we've provided some administrative controls to allow edits to that field. And then, as we mentioned with the dashboards, the ability to embed some of those dashboards into third-party web properties is going to be key for being able to, say, the county coordinators in Pennsylvania, they're going to have a third-party website, so not a login FieldDoc site, but they can embed that dashboard to do outreach and targeted messaging to the general public. For year 3, we're again going to continuously be getting feedback and suggesting next steps for FieldDoc. And so what we've received feedback on and is currently on the docket is to look at the development of a planning module. A lot of users have been interested in those planning targets, and so looking at the watershed delineation, going to a particular practice location, as well as some of the prioritization and opportunity layers that we at the Conservancy and some of the other state partners have created. We're looking to implement some of those. We have a confidence metric pilot that I'll actually be going in more detail in a couple of slides that we're going to be looking to implement and push through FieldDoc. And then we're looking at third-party data services for the dashboard functionality, development and documentation of all of the APIs that are going to be supporting the back-end modeling and analytic functionality. As I mentioned, practices are tied to programs in FieldDoc, specifically usually funding grant programs such as the NIFWIF INSR grants, or Maryland DNR, the Virginia Environmental Endowment. A number of kind of funding programs use this as a tracking field. And what we've done is basically allowed a practice to be reported to multiple programs. And so this is going to be released in the upcoming year, meaning that if it received funding from multiple programs, you don't need to go in and create 2 separate pages for it, but rather just attach the 2 funding programs to the single reported practice. And then we are working on supporting in-field data collection, so that a user could go out on a tablet or an iPhone or an Android and really edit some of this data or report on it from the field, so you don't have to be sitting at a desktop in an office. As we mentioned, there's a lot of back-end modeling in FieldDoc. So specifically one that we've focused on this year and will continue to focus on in year 3 is nutrient reduction modeling. And so we did a lot of research and development on what I mentioned earlier is the confidence metric. And so this is looking at Drexel's modeling as well as CAS data. And what we're looking to do is highlight projects that would meet or exceed the modeled average of load reduction for nutrient management. And so we're trying to influence project planning towards some of those more impactful practices or geographies, and trying to really highlight when a project would not meet or exceed the modeled average, meaning that it might not be the best location or the best practice to invest money in. And so for We've had a lot of discussions between our project team and the CAS team to work on methodology. We are focused on integrating high resolution data, specifically looking at Drexel's modeling efforts and making sure that the CAS team is fully aware of the processes and that they align with the modeling that goes on for the entire watershed, and that we're using the CAS data properly for a good comparison. And our next steps is, after all of these discussions and the research and development of the past year, we're going to pilot the confidence metric concept with a couple sets of practices, and then we'll be going through a kind of review period and testing and seeing how this nutrient reduction modeling goes. And the goal would be then to take that modeling and the pilot and integrate it into the user experience in FieldDoc. And so this would provide an example. So there is a footprint here for a forested buffer, and the larger footprint is actually utilizing APIs from Drexel, the rapid watershed delineation that Lewis mentioned earlier. And what this does is look at all of the land that drains to that forested buffer and then run the nutrient reduction modeling based off of that. So you're looking specifically for the nitrogen, phosphorus, and suspended solids coming from the drainage area to that specific practice, and not just an assumed average. So that's kind of an overview of what we're doing and what our partners are doing. So we'll take any questions.
Yeah, we actually had a couple questions in the chat for this presentation too specifically. So we'll start with John Bateman's question. John asked specifically, how do you track voluntary residential BMPs? These represent a fair percentage of implemented BMPs in the coastal plain.
Yeah. So I can answer. Part of that is that FieldDoc is available for tracking bay-wide already. Our focus through this project, we're going to be focusing on certain funding partners as well as state and regional partners. So FieldDoc might have some outreach specifically in the future to look at voluntary residential BMPs, but currently it'll be focused on working with our state and regional partners to try and get them to get more users to track those voluntary residential BMPs. This is, like I said, FieldDoc is a great platform to allow them to do it. That would be separate from any of the cost-shared reporting processes that currently go on with the state. So it opens the door for more residential and voluntary practices to be reported, but we don't currently work directly with any of the users.
Great. And obviously, if people want to follow up more, Lewis and Katie's emails are on the screen. And our second and last question, just to keep things moving along, from Jason Kepler, does FieldDoc consider the effect of BMP verification on tracking progress against metric targets?
So this is actually a conversation that we are looking at to move into towards the later part of year 3. But BMP verification, specifically looking at how long a practice sits and can be credited before it expires and needs to get re-verified for it to continue being credited towards the goals for the TMDL. We're working on potentially, we basically just started the conversations on potentially integrating some BMP verification addendum to FieldDoc so that a user might get pinged. Like I said, this is kind of in development, but it's a conversation that I know multiple jurisdictions across the watershed are interested in. So feel free to reach out if you have ideas.
Great. All right, so we're just going to move on to the last presentation, and then feel free again to type in any more questions. We'll take those at the very end. So Jake?
All right. Well, thank you everybody for sticking around for the final presentation. My name is Jake Lazier, and I'm Senior Geospatial Analyst here at the Conservancy. And this objective is more internal facing, focused on general geospatial support for the CBP to allow all of our partners to further integrate the data that we've been talking about in objectives 1 through 3 more sustainably, more ease of accessly in ways that make the most sense. So Rachel, next slide. So that goal came across in a couple different ways. In year 2, we've started an initiative to catalog GIS layers throughout the Bay watershed as a whole to try to find what we're calling emergent layers to support our GIS work moving forward and find what are the most common things. We also wanted to get an understanding of within the Bay program and its great network of partners, how familiar are individuals with GIS, and we used the cross-gate mapping initiative from the Bay program as a proxy for that. And then the last part of year 2, which we'll get into as well, to support the familiarity work was the solicitation and hiring of a research consultant. So Rachel, next slide. So yeah, the GIS cataloging initiative. In layman's terms, this is basically a spreadsheet looking to record GIS layers that exist in Bay-wide decision support tools, really looking at what 6 tools to start, but what other ones exist out there. Utilize GIS to support decision making. What are the layers that are going into these tools? Really having an understanding of these are the most common things the GIS practitioners in the Bay are using over and over again, aka emergent layers or layers that appear across multiple tools. And what are the ways that they are projected, documented, put together? Which ways are basically the community using these layers, and what are the themes and aspects we can take from them to influence production of the data sets from objectives 1 through 3. Basically, if these layers are being used pretty thoroughly and throughout the Bay, we should be matching them as well. So Rachel, next slide. So to give a brief overview of what tools we started to catalog here, we wanted to look at, again, Bay-wide decision-making tools, ranging not just from a region or a state, but the entire watershed. So we looked at EPA's EJ Screen, the Army Corps of Engineers Draft Comprehensive Water Resource and Restoration Plan, the Conservation Partnerships Conservation Atlas, the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Data Dashboard, the Cross-Gate Mapping Initiative, and the recently introduced Chesapeake Healthy Watersheds Assessment. These 6 tools are obviously not the only partnership scale Bay-wide initiatives using GIS, but we wanted to start with at least these 6 to get a good, wide understanding, cast a wide net about what sort of data sets and tools are being utilized across the Bay. Next slide. And here are the sort of things that we are trying to capture when we are looking at these tools. Essentially, these layers, or these fields, so to speak, came from a variety of discussions and suggestions from our partners, both internal and external, to figure out what are the things that when someone is looking for data, whether they're a professional GIS practitioner or just a individual interested community member who wants to learn a little bit more, what are the things that they're going to look for immediately to get a better understanding? These include things like the layer name, a description of the layer, the resolution of the layer, whether we're talking 1 meter land cover information or 30 meter land cover as well. The minimum mapping unit, this one was a suggestion, really getting an idea of what is the minimum region that a data set is appropriately used for. Obviously, if a data set was made for a specific county, we're not going to recommend it for use statewide or baywide, and vice versa. Where the data is coming from, how you get access to it, whether that's from the website itself or the organization or a map service link, the original extent of said data, whether it's a national data set, regional, state, etc., when it was produced, when or if it will be updated moving forward. And the last data, or the last field, was something we've started to come up with to really get a better understanding of, okay, so-and-so practitioner wants to come in and find data relevant to forests and water quality. That way we can look at these 800 so fields at this point and really get an idea of, these are all the forest related data sets and all the agricultural related data sets. And this is supposed to match CBP's open data website. So next slide. And we've started to find from some initial research these emergent layers that multiple partners across the Bay are using. So we'll be basing sort of our products off of these. One of them is land cover and land use. This is our high resolution data set, but also the national land cover data set. This is something that's pretty common and sort of a base ingredient across these tools, but also things like administration boundaries. What census date are we using for those state level boundaries? Who is using what in regards to that, and how should those data sets be included, as well as protected development from Peter Claggett and the Chesapeake Bay Program, and a variety of floodplains and flood data from FEMA looking at sea level rise and 100-year flood information. So next slide. So we've got sort of our tools, what people are using day to day, but who are those people and what is their familiarity with these tools? Are they using them? Are they not using them? And what are the barriers, and how can we apply those barriers to the tools and products and data sets from objectives 1 through 3? What are the insights? What are the lessons learned? What are the ideas and use cases from the Bay Program internally? So we did a very brief survey within the Chesapeake Bay Program using their cross-skip mapping initiative as a proxy to see what they're using GIS for. Rachel, next slide. So this was a survey of coordinators, staffers, other key stakeholders to capture their familiarity with the cross-skip mapping project as a sort of initial proxy to identify such barriers and record some more demographic information. So that's really referring to their different participation in work groups, what organizations they're representing within the Bay Program, really kind of seeing who is responding. And when it comes to GIS, is it just the traditional partners, or is it people who we haven't even thought about yet? So I'm going to share a couple of brief results from that survey. A lot of people, and this is a very familiar story that we've been coming across again and again, a lot of people said that they were familiar with the project itself, were familiar with cross-skip mapping, and were familiar with other GIS products. But next slide. They haven't really used it as much to support their work. And I'm sure a lot of people on this call can relate. You may have heard about the high resolution land cover data before. You may have been to the website to look at it and play around the map, but you haven't really been able to integrate it into your work in a way that you find super helpful at this time. So we're really trying to figure out ways to go around that. And next slide. There is still a highly expressed interest in utilizing these tools better, utilizing these GIS data sets better. What makes the most sense, and how is that going to work? So we basically have a general knowledge of these tools, a lack of actual inclusion from your Monday through Friday 9 to 5 data set life, but a high level of interest. So what are we going to do? How are we going to take those insights and turn them into actionable items? Next slide. And we are doing that by basically asking for help. We're hiring an outside perspective, a data research consultant, which will basically be working directly with our team to identify those needs from a user research and user engagement perspective, someone who is not as in the weeds and may have a fresher, cleaner take on it as well, to really get the professional perspective on UX, UI, and user research and how we can fulfill those needs a little bit better. Next slide. And moving forward, we'll be taking that work from the consultant, working directly with them to better fully understand the barriers in place and how we can glean those insights and better apply them from a professional user research angle to objectives 1 through 3, especially as within the next year with year 3, more and more data products will be finally present as far as like publicly facing. So really focusing on how do we make sure our products that we are creating are directly integratable through our primary partner, the Chesapeake Bay Program, but also all of our other partners. And we'll also continue to expand and solidify the GIS catalog that I talked a little bit about at the beginning and find a permanent place for it to be accessed, basically finding the best mode of operation for all possible users for that tool and what makes the most sense with that. So that's a very brief overview of Objective 4. It's more internal facing, of course. And I think now, Rachel, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Thank you, Jake, and thank you for all the objectives for presenting today. It doesn't look like we have any new questions, so that means we can wrap up a little early. But again, here are all of our emails. These are just the project leads for each project. And then at the very bottom, there's that link to our website that has Chesapeake Bay Program tab there, and that is where we will be putting the recording of the webinar up And I will also be emailing out these slides with those Menti, the polling results within the slides, so you can kind of see what people were interested in as well. So if there are no other questions, thank you for coming today, and thanks for listening in. And yeah, feel free to email us if there's any additional questions. All right, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.